Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Ryan Pacatte, and I'm going to give an overview of the budget hearing that'll take place later this evening in case folks aren't not able to make it. So we've been working hard on the 25-26 budget, and I'm going to provide an overview. I have a couple of targets for today. One is to review Avon's process and values. The second is to examine revenues and expenditures. That's ultimately what a budget comes down to. And I'm going to share some of the aspirations that came forward and what we're doing with some of those requests. First, a quick update on foundation aid, the executive proposal, and the final budget. Foundation aid formula. So there was a large Rockefeller study. I set some communications about this, and they looked at all the variables in the foundation aid study. Up until this point, we were not aware of what changes were going to be made to the foundation aid formula. There were some minor changes made and adjustments, but at this point, it's going to be ongoing work. Nothing overly significant is affecting Avon with the Rockefeller study this year. Back in January, Governor Hochul proposed a 2% due diligence increase. And then in the New York State's final budget, that number held. There was some hope that there would be an increase based on the progress made by the one house budgets. However, the 2% due minimum increase is what held. We're going to continue the updates on the foundation aid formula. There's full funding for universal school meals that is being continued. There's an increase to the BOCES aidable salary cap that'll affect us a little bit, but not a lot. Some districts are a little bit more dependent upon BOCES for some of their salaries based on some transitional staff work. And then there's a 2-year extension on the zero emission school buses where a waiver can be applied for. And we're excited about that. And there's also a 2-year extension on the removal of the cap that impacted retiree earnings. In a tough job market, it's nice when we can have some retirees continue to work for us without being penalized. So a quick overview of the revenues. Revenues are the monies coming in. They really, in schools, come from 3 different places: New York State aid, the local tax levy, and then other sources, which are also typically local sources as well. Looking back on 3 years, a quick division of where the funds come from. For Avon, the majority of the funding should come from New York State aid. It's roughly shared somewhat equally, a little bit more for state aid and a little bit less than local taxes, and then other revenues that are used to bridge the gap between the two and versus what we actually need to spend. So a quick 3-year history. The item in blue is the state aid. You can see the 23-24 school year is the year that is probably the most appropriate, the most ideal for us. You can see here that in that year, when we became fully funded from New York State aid actually accounted for slightly more than half of the total school budget, with less than 45% coming from the local tax revenues, and then the difference made up from local revenues. Jump forward to this year, you can see the aid from New York State is staying flat. We're receiving the 2% increase from New York State is holding here, because the budget has increased. The New York State aid portion only going up by 2% puts it slightly under 50%, which is not where we want to be. But we also are proposing no increase to the tax levy this year. So you can see the really quite a sizable change in the percentage coming from the local tax share, which means that these other sources have to be relied upon more aggressively. You can see they're more aggressively relied upon here than they've been in the last couple of years. This total is about 11.7%. That's something that we can do for a year, perhaps 2, but it's certainly not sustainable over time. When you look at the revenue summaries, just a quick year to year, the real property taxes are staying the same at $10,800,000, or close to $10,900,000. You can see the state aid portion going up. Part of the reason why this is going up, if you do the math on that, it's more than 2%. It's because we anticipate expense-based aid in the form of building aid, because we're in the midst of the building project right now. But those reports will not get finalized until later in the year, and that's when the aid will be adjusted. Kristen Murphy has been working with our municipal advisors to try to be as accurate as possible there. When we look at pilots and interest earnings, we made some adjustments to interest earnings based on what we've seen for the last couple of years, to try to be a little less conservative in our projections there. Looking at the appropriated fund balance allows us to carry some work into next year. So for example, you'll see later in the budget newsletter some proposals for our capital outlay work and proposals for a transfer to capital work that'll address HVAC climate control issues. This year's budget was impacted in the same way, and we're doing renovations to the athletic stadium in terms of the field turf and the gymnasium. In terms of for both, we're addressing the name and imagery mandate that came through last year. And then finally, in order to balance the budget, we are projecting the need for $1.6 million approximately from our use of reserves. And that's because we will project that amount needing to be used at this point because we have an obligation to project a structurally balanced budget. And then looking into the expenditures. So we just reviewed where the funds are coming from. What does the money get spent upon? So being a people business, about $12,600,000 will go to salaries. Those are salaries for everybody who works here. You'll see a pretty sizable jump this year. This is a result of a couple of different things. One, we have negotiated agreements that come into the contracts every year. And then this year, prior to the start of the school year, we made a market adjustment on everyone's salary, a small market adjustment there. And then following the comptroller's report, an additional market adjustment was made. So it's really quite a bit of a difference this year, but it's not anticipated to be that same level into future years, as this year was abnormal in those two market adjustments coming after the start of the year. Within the benefits, the TRS and ERS, those are based upon requirement pension contributions to the teacher's retirement system and to the employee retirement system, as well as Social Security. Those are standard increases there. Healthcare benefits. So our health consortium costs are going up about 12%. But when we retroactively looked at our last two budgets to see where we have been a little bit too conservative based on feedback we received this year, the projection of healthcare costs was something that came to the surface. So while the consortium costs are going up 12%, we did not have to raise this 12% because we're trying to decrease the margin for contingency that we had there in the attempt to become a little less conservative. This plan increase to BOCES, this has to do with student programming. This could be vocational experiences for students in the high school level. It could also be unique programming for students with special needs. It also is a variety of services that BOCES provides us. So for example, health and safety inspections would be a service that we buy into, and they work in partnership with us to conduct some of those health and safety things like fire inspections, for example. Debt service transfer, so a fairly significant increase here, but this is part of a planned adjustment based on the capital project, and a portion of this will be offset with a planned use of the debt service reserve as a planned payment as we are under construction. And then you see the contractual supplies and benefits. This will address things such as the SRO programming coming more to the greater percentage of the SRO program being picked up by the schools, and then just some traditional adjustments based on market costs. So the budget planning addresses a variety of things. I mentioned before, a capital outlay project and a transfer to capital project for HVAC systems at the middle school. This is largely related to some of the climate control requirements that were recently passed by the state of New York. Some of our staffing aspirations, we use data to consider whether or not we needed to open another section at the elementary school, and we did. We also used data to take a look at our special education programming and determined that we needed an additional special education teacher at the middle school. We're also hiring a cleaner, and then we're also trying to be more systematic in sending folks to conferences, in addition to all of our professional learning opportunities held in-house, professional learning opportunities available to us through BOCES, professional learning opportunities available to us through the Teacher Center, for example. We're looking at being a little bit more systematic in terms of conferences. I mentioned briefly the SRO program. We are moving ahead with 2 SROs, one at the elementary school, one at the middle high school, and then some additional student programming factors, continuing with the student supply initiative that the Board of Education started last year. Exciting new travel COSER for student travel, for educational travel. By doing it with BOCES and doing it with EF Tours, we are able to generate some aid on future student travel, which should help keep the family costs down. And then the laptops will be coming to students in grades 9 through 12. We addressed some of the teaching positions that were talked about over to the left. Some intervention support that started last year that we're continuing this year. And then off-hours learning opportunities such as enrichment and summer programming. Dual credit offerings, not only through a grant, but also some in-house investment. That's exciting new COSER through BOCES as well. And then we've been talking about furniture master planning. Part of that will come through the ordinary contingent budget at the end of the year if that opportunity presents itself, but also use of the vehicle and equipment reserves. Within the back page of the newsletter, there was a call to provide a little bit more information about some comparative tax information, both within the municipalities within Avon, but then also around the region. So the back page of the budget newsletter shows 24-25 and 25-26 the anticipated impact on taxes based on the average home cost. And then the newsletter also provides a link to the Livingston County tax rate website. So an overall summary, we feel like this is a very good budget. We're significantly addressing some student program aspirations. Several of the staff aspirations that came forward have been addressed. In addition to the aspirations, we've also addressed some calls and feedback to become a little less conservative. I feel like we're making a good faith effort there. We're once again below the allowable levy. In fact, the district has been below the allowable tax levy for 7 out of the last 8 years. And we've been at 0% for 2 of those 8 years. So we feel like that's a good approach and a good consideration for the local tax impact. We're addressing safety and security, and we're also have addressed staff compensation using some data compared to the region. I mentioned briefly the taxes and the idea that we've been below the allowable levy for 7 of the last 8 years. This is something that the board has been aware of and something that we've been working on, which is why we've consistently been below the allowable levy. The green represents what the allowable tax calculation predicts. So that is New York State's calculation that says this is the amount of money that the local community should be willing to additionally invest in the school programming. And because the board's been aware of Avon's tax rate, they've consistently been working to try to keep that very manageable. Why are Avon's taxes where they're at? This goes back to that long history of foundation aid funding that I've talked about repeatedly. The $24 million that New York State's formula for school funding has calculated for Avon, and then they persistently did not provide those funds to the Avon community until very recently. So there are 4 propositions in the overall budget. The overall spending of $27,652,546. There's the annual bus vehicle purchase. So this is for student transportation, seeking permission to stick to our replacement cycle for student transportation vehicles. None of these vehicles are zero emission. These are traditional vehicles. There's a vehicle and equipment reserve. These are funds that have been set aside for purchases of equipment. This is where we're doing some of our furniture master planning. That's why it's an additional $250,000 here is dedicated to redoing the student classroom furniture. And then traditionally we spend about $125,000. The $125,000 plus the $250 is what totals the $375,000. And the $125,000 is for more facilities vehicles and equipment. So it'll be things like a gator, a pickup truck for the facilities department, a part of the vehicle replacement cycle, helmets for lacrosse and football, etc. And then technology purchase, we're requesting permission to use the technology reserve to help us with some infrastructure upgrades as it relates to ports, switches, and servers. We've been able to do some offsets with E-rate and Smart Schools funding, as well as some BOCES purchases in the past. But this year we need to lean into that reserve. Ideally, get permission to spend funds from that reserve, which is why the reserve exists and why the funds are there. On the Board of Education, there are 3 seats up for vote this year. The first is the seat held by Vice President Jim Colt. Dr. Colt is not seeking re-election. Kyle Montag is running for that position. There's a seat currently held by incumbent Karen Vanderbilt. Karen is seeking re-election for that position, and she is being challenged by Michael Garrett. And then there's the 2-year term, remainder of a 2-year term that was Beth Peck's seat. However, Mike Carroll was appointed to that position. He is seeking to hold that seat, and Rebecca Honan is also running for that seat. More information about the candidates can be found in the budget newsletter as well. The annual voting will take place next Tuesday in the middle school library. That's a change of location. Due to construction, we're holding the vote in the library instead of the auditorium. And the vote will take place from 1 to 9 p.m. on Tuesday, May 20th. There is a ton of information on the district's website related to the budget information. If you can't find something that you're looking for there, if you have some questions about what has been presented, please feel free to contact myself or our business official, Mrs. Kristen Murphy. We'd be happy to try to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a great day.